everybody. Welcome to The Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Bisolans, and every Saturday, we look at some stories shaping our continent. First up, we will discuss the arrest of Joe Ajaero, the Nigerian Labour Congress president, and its implications for the labor movement and the broader political terrain of the country. Next, a notorious terrorist leader, Bello Turji, has issued a chilling warning to the Hausa people, necessitating a deep dive into the escalating tensions between the Hausa and Fulani communities in northwestern Nigeria. Finally, we'll turn our attention to devastating floods that have ravaged parts of West Africa. What is the impact of these floods on the region's overall stability? Joining me for insight on these stories is Confidence Makari, Senior Security Analyst at SBM Intelligence. Welcome, Confidence.
It's good to be back here. Thank you for having me once again.
Yeah, it's good to have you. Yeah, so moving to our first story, which is about the arrest of Nigerian Labour Congress president. I just want to know, has the government said anything about why he was arrested? Are we still in the dark on this issue, or has any reason been given?
We still are in the dark largely, because one of the reasons I think the build up to this comes from his previous arrest with in the hands of the police force, and but before then there was a raid in the building where the NLC came. The NLC, sorry, the a raid on the building, police raid on the building that's the NLC occupies in Abuja. It's National Secretariat. The police alleged that there is a link between the NLC leader and a British man, Andrew Wine, who was accused of financing the End Bad Governance protest, which the government believes that it's a ploy, is a regime change ploy. So the Britain, Andrew Wine was said to have escaped to London and is being vilified by the Nigerian members of the Nigerian security forces, especially the police and the DSS, for allegedly financing the End Bad Governance protest in August to overthrow the government. So that is the police's own explanation for arresting Joe Ajaero as of the time when they picked him up and they released him a few hours later, following a lot of backlash from people, especially within the civil society space. And so a few days later or a few weeks later, him being picked up by the DSS, I think continues in that light. I think what anybody who's perceptive enough would bring this down to is that the government got spooked by the spontaneity of the End Bad Governance protest. And as various Nigerian governments historically are wont to do, is that they viewed this protest as anti-government protest, in the sense that the protesters against the government is something that has been a characteristic even for. So it might be that for the DSS's part, it might be that they are trying to scapegoat the NLC president for first of all the shutdown that land way, and then actively supporting the government to scapegoat him to their future bad behavior. Did you hear what I said?
Yeah, I kind of lost you towards the end. I think network is a bit bad. But I think I got the gist of what you were saying. All right. So, but what does this arrest, what exactly, what kind of mindset is this kind of arrest giving, to Nigerians, considering that the person that is currently in power was seen as a democracy activist in the past, and now there's been a crackdown on, journalists, even like, for example, recently Pidom was arrested, and then now Joe Ajaero. Do you think that in Nigeria the the democratic climate is changing, it's shifting. Are we coming into this more of an autocratic space, or are these actually arrests that are normal, they are legal, lawful, and okay?
So at the beginning, when he was arrested, I trying to remember which of the security agencies said it. They were like, nobody's above the law. But what exactly he did wrong is not being said, and so it puts a lot of skepticism forward as to what exactly would they mean by not him not being above the law. The immediate concern or the future concern is that the clampdown on Nigeria's civic space and civil societies continue. The previous government tried it both fiscally and legally, with, for instance, the 2016 NGO regulation bill that sought to stifle dissent, especially from the Christian clergy who were seen as hostile to the government, and so doing tried to regulate their tenure, especially the tenures of the leaders of big Christian organizations in Nigeria, which was severely restricted. They also tried to use the NGO regulation bill to stop foreign funding of NGOs who they believe are being used to fund terrorism in the country, and so many others. So the Tinubu administration has simply continued in that same playbook of saying every form of dissent as an attack against the government. And I can't even call it an attack against the state, because even though the government is representative of the state, it is not the state. So criticizing Tinubu does not necessarily mean criticizing Nigeria. Patriotism does not necessarily mean loyalty to the government all the time. And something Mark Twain will say is that patriotism is loyalty to the country all the time and loyalty to the government only when it deserves it. So what the Tinubu administration has been doing so far is a targeted stifling of dissent. In the same time, when the DSS went after Joe Ajaero, it also went after SERAP. That's the Social and Economic Accountability Rights Project, who is a prominent civil society group that has been at the forefront of holding government accountable. So they've gone after a lot of them. This week, some end bad governance protesters were granted bail, which ordinarily they shouldn't have been, because they were not part of rioters, and so many other things that I think largely symbolically what Tinubu is trying to do is to signal to would-be protesters that this kind of behavior, criticizing government and protesting, no matter how civil it is totally unwelcome. And in the long run, it adds to the sense about where Nigeria's ranking on the Democratic Freedom Index is going to be. But if I'm to make a postulation, I would say that going forward, it actually does not look good in any way.
Well, that's really sad. But do you agree with people who say that the reason why Joe Ajaero has not said anything, because some people actually believe that he knows why he has been arrested, but maybe the reason he hasn't said anything is because the government has debt on him, they have something on him. Do you agree with that? Like maybe there's something he has done that because as an activist, as someone who is a Labour president, people would have expected more response or maybe agitation from his end, but he just seems to have been taking it well. What do you think?
It's not something I can speak readily to. I do think that if that assertion or if that perception holds true, I would think that largely the silence that the C would trickle down to the NLC. I think one of the reasons why he was released quickly from the DSS custody is because of how much fire and brimstone the NLC threatened. They threatened to mobilize their allies in the other civil society groups to shut down the country if he is not released. I think partly has to do why he was released. So I can't authoritatively speak to the government having debt on him. If it so happens, I wouldn't be surprised. The Nigerian labor movement for centuries has been a substance that the successive governments have tried to co-opt and tried to rule by divide and conquer strategy. I mean, during the Obasanjo administration, we had a United Nigerian Labour Congress movement that was divided into the NLC and the Trade Union Congress, which for any regular observer would notice that the latter, which is the TUC, was funded by the Obasanjo administration to divide the cause and to weaken the ability of the NLC to hold the government accountable. So it wouldn't be new, it wouldn't be surprising, but at the moment, I do not really have any facts at hand as to corroborating that assertion.
All right. So I'm actually concerned, considering, I don't know, some will consider this tactic a heavy-handed one, and I'm just thinking that if the government continues, this trajectory, what is going to be the reputation of Nigeria, before the global community, and then even speaking of human rights and the right to protest, the right to things like this. How will this suppression affect labor unions, civil society organizations in Nigeria, the balance of power between the government and the public?
the the perception we would have internationally is that we'll move from an illiberal democracy down to an autocratic one. And so in many of these rankings, especially from Freedom House or from the US State Department and several others, you don't necessarily have to be a military junta for you to fall under that category, and it's going to badly hurt foreign investment. Since 2020, the caliber of foreign direct investments in Nigeria has been shrinking, and many of this has to do largely with the absence of the rule of law and other technicalities that are arising from issues such as the Land Use Act, among several others. A big part of what drives investment into a country is how democratic a government is. But with the Tinubu government sliding into autocracy, even far away from the illiberal democracy that Nigeria has been for some time, it really paints a really bad picture for Nigeria, not only for the investor perspective, but from the international perspective as a whole. Um, so I do think that there is an urgent need for course correction, and the course correction does not necessarily have to come in the quick release of arrested labor leaders. I think it's a democratic culture that needs to be built across board that deals with not arresting people because of simply because you feel like arresting them. You only arrest people because they are accused of a crime, suspected of being involved in a crime, and with tangible evidence by which people are not going to question the efficacy of what you're prosecuting them with. Except there is a course correction, I don't think that our international reputation is going to be helped anytime soon.
All right, but is there a way for the government to balance these things out? Like, is there a way to address activism, dissent, while at the same time maintaining democratic values and avoiding authoritarianism? Is there a way to find that balance, or what do you think?
There are constitutional provisions for this. It's called the libel and slander laws. So if you think that you've been defamed or any of that sort, or you think that there is a particular terror threat and everything, you do your investigation and arrest the person, and then take the person to court within 48 hours by writ of what by provision of the writ of habeas corpus and other legal principles that mandate that you should not hold a suspect in custody for more than 48 hours. You take the person to court, and then if the court says that you should release this person on bail, you simply release them and not holding them in perpetuity. So where the Nigerian government misses its mark mostly is that it doesn't respect the basic principles of legal authority, and it does its things arbitrarily, so much so that the legal process is an afterthought, especially when there is a huge outcry about things that rather keep secret. So there is, of course, a balance, and the balance is in constitutionalism and the protection and respect for human rights.
All right, thank you. Moving on to our next story, which is about a notorious terrorist leader, Bello Turji, who issued a great warning to the Hausa people to desist from attacking land. Confidence, I want you to walk us through the historical context to this. It seems like there just seems to be a long line of hostility between the Fulanis and Hausa in the north. Can you walk us through the historical background to this conflict?
Okay, so ever since the current area that is known as Nigeria's northwest was created, there's been this uneasy coexistence between the Hausas and the Fulanis. The Hausas are the most dominant in terms of population. The Fulanis are the most dominant in terms of political power. So it wasn't always like this. Before the 1804 jihad, the seven Hausa states used to be independent states that were constantly at war with each other. And so it took the 1804 jihad by Osman Danfodio to set up the Fulani Caliphate that intermarried. They used tactics such as intermarriage and the understanding of the Hausa language to rule. So when Nigeria was created, instead of the North or the North being known as Hausa or Fulani, it was known as Hausa Fulani instead. But that was just on the surface. Below the surface, these tensions exist. And what really drives these tensions in the past stemmed largely from what some people would say the population explosion, climate change, and the like. So there were, should I say, grazing routes that the colonial administrations, the British colonial administration designated following historical grazing routes across northern Nigeria. So when these things were gazetted into the British colonial administration under the North Native Authority system, many of the areas you now know as the Middle Belt were not so occupied as to be having a population explosion where waterways are being occupied by human settlement. And so, apart from that, the traditional rulership system existed quite well. So much so that if a Fulani headsman allows his cow or his cattle to graze into a farm owned by a local or a native, the Fulani herdsman is brought before the local traditional ruler and is paid and is mandated to pay for the damage. This continued until I think the 1970s and the 1980s, where in the first place the military dictatorship system and military rule simply degraded the efficacy of the traditional rulership system and bastardized it so much so that it became a mere appendage of the state, subject to its whims and caprices. So that respect he had, it used to have, it no longer had. As a result, people could not necessarily go to it in traditional sense of justice to find a respite. And to make matters worse, justice in the modern sense is inaccessible to many people. Then, if you add this to climate change and you add population explosion routes to the grazing routes, where you have pastures and water, and then you add the lack of justice, lack of access to justice, you have a dynamite on your hand. So by 2011, we've had a lot of Fulanis who had refused to move from the ancient way of moving cattle, which is via nomadism, moving cattle across many places to get pasture. They refused to move from that into ranching, which is the much more modern form of cattle rearing. And so doing that, they came into direct contact with farming communities, and it led to pillaging of farms. And in the absence of community-based justice system, which was to compel these guys to pay for damages, communities took matters into their own hands and killed cattle, which of course was a direct attack on the economic survival of the Fulanis, and it led to mutual recriminations where the Fulanis, having losing their economic strength, many of them decided to take up arms against the farmers, and then the farmers, to safeguard their interests, especially their farms and their livelihood, decided to take up arms against the Fulanis. So that's the historical concept and the background in the ethnic conflict in the Northwest. But I think that by 2011, that is where the problem exacerbated, so much so that I think it began in Zamfara, where bandit groups set up themselves to become behemoths and kingpins that were occupying large numbers, a large territory, far away from urbanization in the rural territories that Nigerian security forces cannot reach, owing to the fact that for years these spaces have become ungoverned spaces, and the Nigerian state basically ceded them to these groups. Bello Turji comes from that particular class of people like Buhari and Daji, Kachala Turuji, and the rest of that. Some of them who have been killed by the Nigerian state, some of them on the run. So him issuing these threats against farmers, Hausa farmers, is much likely a continuation of the struggle that has been going on at least for the past 5 decades.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, all right. So this man has been guilty of so many crimes, attacking a boss, being the mastermind behind the slaughter of over 200 people in Zamfara State, and different things like that. But it still seems like the government has not been able to, bring him under control, arrest him or anything. I know there was a time when um they were supposed to, or they even tried to strike a peace accord with the government of the state at the time. But why is it that is still going on, even making going as far as making public threats and sharing it. And for some reason, the government has not been able to do anything about him, to arrest him, or is there more to this issue? Is it possible that there are people in power that are backing him, giving him the resources he needs, or why is it that this man is still very much around despite all he has done?
So it's given the northern terrain, taking out these guys, especially through military action, is not um, it's not a sustainable. Has not really proven to be a sustainable enterprise because as you take one out, if you use a smite the shepherd strategy, somebody else is going to rise up and take their place. So I as I was saying earlier that Bello Turji comes from a long list of bandit kingpins that have pervaded the Northwest. And one of the reasons why it hasn't really been taken out is that he has managed to survive all of the attempted attacks on him by the Nigerian military. And also, a great way of his survival is that he has been able to, I think, gain sufficient experience by aligning with not bandit groups now. I'm talking about aligning with jihadists with who has enough experiences fighting in Libya and parts of the Middle East, especially in Yemen and Algeria. And it has enabled him to improve his skills, especially with regards to attacking Nigerian military forces and stealing their weapons. So if you see some of his videos, the caliber of weapons he uses are in terms of the local context can only be used by the Nigerian military. I'm talking about M4 and the stealing of armored personnel carriers, which are then repurposed into making local weapons that are sophisticated enough to at least take on the state forces. Apart from that, it seems to have should I say a forced support from the local populations from where he occupies. And given how very porous the Nigerian borders are, especially in its northwest frontier, it is easy for Bello Turji and his likes to take heat from the Nigerian military in one particular section of the northwest and then disappear into the border with Niger and then make a resurfacing when things have calmed down. He's 30 years old. I mean, all he has known in his life generally, especially in his adult life, is violence. And he is trying to, with this particular threat, I think he's trying to morph into some kind of a savior for the Fulanis, I think, which he is doing part of his strategy to curry domestic support for his activities, which in recent weeks has been buoyed by bandits, should I say, community social responsibility on TikTok, by which they distribute giveaways to people in need on TikTok. So I do think that his attempt to be an arbiter of the Fulani grievances uh, in the next few weeks, it will remain to be seen how easily he's supported. But I do know for a fact that many of the people under his ranks are Fulanis. Many of these guys that are bandit kingpins in the Northwest are Fulanis. So people in their ranks naturally have to be Fulanis. And then the people who are fighting against them, especially in the vigilante services, are Hausas. So I do think that, especially in the short to medium term, part of what must have driven him to make this particular statement against Hausa populations in the Northwest could be that uh, parts, many of his guys, if perhaps family members, could have been attacked or killed extrajudicially by members of the vigilante associations that are set up by the state governments to go after these guys, and then he is trying to take the revenge out on the innocent population. But if we look at the previous clash between Hausas and Fulanis, which happened as recently as 2 years ago at the maximum, if he follows on with his threat, I think we're going to have something that is likely bigger than the last conflagration we saw.
All right. So How have local vigilante groups like Yan Sakai, how their involvement in the conflict, how has it maybe quelled or exacerbated what's going on in the north?
The state government sets them up to complement the um, what is it called now? The efforts of security services. So what why they did that was because they felt that the military is stretched, perhaps quite rightly so, and events in the northwest in terms of counterterrorism operations have not really yielded the necessary results. So they decided that they are going to set up um, their own organizations, state back, train them, give them weapons to the caliber that they can't find, and then go after these guys. In the past, it used to be an informal arrangement where these vigilantes are based on community level. So they were mostly known as Yan Sakai, and they were accused of a lot of human rights abuses. What the state did over the past 2 years was to formalize them into a much more formal structure where they are not going to be undertaking operations on their own all the time, but most of the time they're going to be aligning with both the police, the DSS, and the military against the bandits. So I do think that to a similar extent, it has curtailed the amount of extrajudicial killings and actions by the group. But these kind of things are dicey, very dicey. It has a penchant to get out of hand, especially when retribution overtakes the sense of urgency, responsibility, and morality. So a certain degree, we've seen in terms of military proclamations on the successes of their missions in collaboration with these guys, we've seen end results. But one thing people will always judge these people is the general state of security in the region. It hasn't really improved. So on that particular note, one could say that the failures of the military is also down to the failure of these guys.
Okay, I know you mentioned that the problem is such that even if the bandit leader is taken out, another person will rise, in its stead. But is there any way, even despite the historical background to this and the fact that problems run deep between the Hausas and the Fulanis, but is there any way to manage this ethnic conflict to ensure justice in such regions, such a way that it does not spread to other regions and they become worse?
The I mentioned it. Excuse me. I mentioned it at the beginning that you can't have peace without having justice. There's no peace without justice. There's no justice. Or there's no peace without justice. Don't mind me. I was about to parrot what the BLM protesters said in 2020. No justice, no peace. But in this particular context, it's the reverse is not necessarily the case. Many people have grievances. The Hausas have grievances. The Fulanis have grievances. They are not being listened to in the more formal setting where the Nigerian state is supposed to exist in its functional space, theoretically, as the impartial arbiter of disputes. It hasn't lived up to that reputation. It hasn't lived up to that billing. So until the Nigerian state improves on its capacity to respond to these aggressions, to respond to these grievances by people, it's really not going to have a lot of peace on that particular frontier. So it needs to improve its reach into these places. It needs to improve its capacity to dispense justice impartially, and it needs to improve its capacity that is in effect going to translate into credibility, that people are going to look at the state and say it is better for me to take my issues to the state, yeah, I'll get justice, than taking the laws into my own hands.
All right, thank you. So moving on to our last story, which is about flooding in West Africa, especially Nigeria, where there was this prediction that from September 48, there are some states that will be greatly affected by further rains and intense rains and all. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, do you think, because this flooding issue has been a recurrent issue over the years, and it just seems like government just comes every time to say the same thing. It almost seems like there's always this reactive stance on it, never something proactive. And also, is it right to blame this whole thing on climate change and or climate is changing and then it's affecting the environment? Or is this just due to the negligence of the government and people, based on lifestyle and just the things we do to the environment, like waste management, drainage systems, and all? What do you think?
I do think it's a combination of both, of everything you've said. The problem with the flooding for this year, as with other years, is that the drainages and the infrastructure that should hold these things are not necessarily being put in the right places. Look at, for say, for instance, since the 1970s, we haven't really constructed new dams to take care of the problems that will arise from the River Niger, or the Niger River rather, overflowing its banks. So when the Alau Dam in Kondoga local government area of Borno State in the northeast overflowed itself, the devastation we are seeing in real time was devastating in a way, in a manner of speaking. So there is no concerted effort by the government beyond proclamations from the Nigerian Meteorological Agency, NIMET, that this is going to happen in so and so number of states. I think this year they called out Rivers, they called Delta, they called Bayelsa, and a host of other states that where the River Niger runs through, that they're going to suffer flooding. So beyond this, nothing much has been done apart from warning. So a lot of things have been mostly around the area and the concept of medicine after death. So when this flooding happened, we've seen the Vice President Kashim Shettima visiting his home state of Borno to commiserate with them, and very importantly, give them rice.
Yes, right.
So yes, give them rice, which doesn't really solve the problem, because according to one official estimate, which I can't verify, they said 70% of the city of Maiduguri is underwater. And so climate change will do its thing. The weather is unpredictable. The rain will fall, and but what we have to do is, given the situation, say for instance in Lagos, where this is an annual recurrence, that in terms of the millimeter of rainfall that falls every year compared with places in other countries where they have it worse, we can manage it with better drainages. Have we done that? We haven't really done that, and that is where the problem really lies.
Yes, so I think that in Nigeria, like we were discussing earlier in the office, we have a general maintenance problem. And I know it's easy to say, oh, the government should do this, should do that. But do you think there's a way we as citizens, not just even talking about the government now, but citizens, a way we can better manage the environment to just to just doing our part in ensuring that every time our roads are not always flooded, because the thing is, even when roads are built, that they get bad on time because of rains and because the rain does not really have any place to flow to, and it causes potholes and all of that. So how can Nigerians really contribute to ensuring that flooding is reduced in their own environment?
The one of the things they have to do is regular maintenances of drainages, which of course is supposed to be a local government function. You see, a lot of these things come to government functions and enforcement mechanisms. So drainages, littering, keeping the environment clean, all of these things are local government functions. And if the local government is absent in this thing in terms of enforcement, we do not really trust people to do the right thing. When I was in school, I think I was studying political science then, and then my lecturer told me clearly that when there is no law, there is no crime. If you bring it down to the Nigerian context, you see that the absence of law enforcement has made this kind of a thing, where people litter on the streets, which seems to be a very, very big pet peeve of mine, a rampant occurrence. You see adults do it, you see children do it, and the likes. So I'm not even blaming them for doing this thing. There are people that are being paid humongous salaries to compel them not to do this thing by way of punishment and to enforce the law, but they don't get to do it. So we can sit here and then we can whine a lot about social responsibility. Personally, in my own capacity, if I get something, maybe a biscuit or a sachet water, a bottle water, I'm not going to litter it on the street. If the next person does it, I'm going to be disgusted by him, but I'm not going to blame him for doing that. He should know better, but he doesn't know better. So the person who knows better, they're supposed to compel him to not do that, has not put the requisite thing in place for him to not do that. So I'm going to give you an instance. I was in Moscow 2 years ago, as you are rightly aware, for a security conference, and despite the fact that Moscow is a very big city. I mean, a colleague and I drove around for about 2 hours before we got to the city center, and where I was also an urban area in the city. I noticed how clean the city is, and regularly when I step out of a building, I'll see people Young people, old people come out to smoke cigarettes and go back. And this is August. I'm not even talking about the winter. I went there during summer. They come out regularly to smoke and everything. But one thing you find on the street is that you will not see a single used cigarette on the floor. You won't see any trash on the floor. And it's simple. Each by the time you walk up to 5-10 meters, you will see a waste basket managed by the state in one corner of the street. So if you need to dispose your waste, you simply make use of the waste basket. And in that situation, if you decide to ignore the waste basket 5-10 meters away from you, and then you put your litter on the floor, people are going to look at you like you're a crazy person. People come out to smoke, and when they are done, they move to the nearest waste basket and then they put it in there. So the Nigerian experience starkly differs from this in the sense that the state hasn't provided these things. So it is not, I don't think I am ready to pin that responsibility to individuals in terms of personal responsibility. This has to do a lot with state capacity. And until we improve our state capacity, I do think that asking Nigerians to take responsibility for flooding is going to be a fool's errand.
Yeah, thank you. We can only hope that the government will enhance its enforcement of waste management practices and implement more effective flooding prevention methods. But thank you so much, Confidence, for participating in today's episode. It was good to have you.
No, Alex, it was good to have me too.
Yeah, and to all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. You can access our podcast by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. For deeper insights into our work, visit our website at sbmintel.com, and remember to connect with us on social media on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. That will be all for today. See you next week. Bye.